welcome to my true criminal abode. As ever, it's wonderful to see you here. I have had COVID and I have been suffering from the 100-day cough. So if my voice starts to go a little bit weird, that's why. Obviously, I'm going to try and edit out as much of the coughing as possible, but if there's any kind of weird splutters or my voice goes slightly strange, I apologise. It's literally, I have had this cough for weeks and weeks. It is a lot better, but my God, it's been a nightmare. And talking for a long period of time can be a bit of a nightmare. So I'm going to do my best, so bear with me. Today's case is a gruesome one. It's Christmas. At least it's nearly Christmas. It's Christmas Eve, actually, as I'm filming this. So tomorrow is Christmas Day. And for most families, Christmas time, the holidays, it's a time of happiness, right? Or it should be. But in 1987, it certainly wasn't a time of happiness for one family, because Christmas time, 1987, is when Ronald Gene Simmons committed one of the most horrific mass murders in American history. And he murdered 14 members of his immediate family, 14 lives. His own family. We're talking his wife, we're talking his children, we're talking his grandchildren. He murdered them all during the Christmas holidays. After he wiped out 14 members of his own family, he wasn't even done there, because 4 days later, he went on a 45-minute terrifying rampage, and that resulted in tragically claiming the lives of another two people, two of his former colleagues, and he injured several other people. So in total, Christmas 1987, 16 people lost their lives. It was the largest family mass murder in US history, and it was also Arkansas's worst mass killing. At the time, it definitely was, and it probably still is today. What should have been a season of joy turned into an absolute nightmare. Obviously, today's case is gruesome, it's brutal, there's murder. There is unfortunately CSA in this case as well. As if murder's not enough, this man is just horrendous. There is CSA as well. So, like I always say, please look after yourself. And I really, really, really mean that. I can't believe I'm doing this case, actually. It's Christmas Eve, and I'm talking about this horrendous massacre. We shouldn't be talking about these horrendous massacres at any time of year, but I don't know. It feels somehow not worse because it's horrendous whenever, but just, I don't know, I don't know. I don't know if you know what I mean, but something about talking about this on Christmas Eve is, it's just so sad. It's so sad. So let's do the case of Ronald Gene Simmons and the nightmare at Christmas. So Ronald Gene Simmons, he was born on July the 15th, 1940 in Chicago, Illinois. Now, in 1943, so he was about 3 years old, his father died from a stroke. And basically, it left the family with kind of financial instability. Any financial stability they had kind of vanished, and it left his mother, Loretta Simmons, struggling to care for her 3-year-old son. Within a year, she did remarry. She married another man called William Griffin. He was a civil engineer for the US Army Corps. So very early on, Ronald was introduced to kind of the army kind of life. So in 1946, the Army Corps, they relocated Griffin to Little Rock in Arkansas. And this was basically the first of many moves that the family had to make. Over the next decade, they were kind of always moving around. And I think this instability kind of, it did affect Ronald. He was never in one place for a long time, and that kind of impacted him. He was unable to maintain friendships before moving on again. And He developed a reputation as a bully and a troublemaker, and he would kind of regularly question authority. And he was prone to these kind of violent outbursts. And ultimately, he was expelled from school. Now, I don't think the family really knew what to do with him, and they sent him to military school. And that was meant to be kind of like a punishment, but to everybody's surprise, he embraced the military lifestyle. The military, it kind of provided him with this stability and this structure, all the things that I think he was lacking because his father died when he was very young. They were moving around constantly, and he kind of just lacked that stability and that structure. And military life was it gave him that. It gave him that thing that he needed. He enjoyed it so much that at the age of 17, he dropped out of school and he joined the Navy. So, what we can see here is that he thrives on control. And this is when the whole kind of thing of control is introduced to him. And for him, it's introduced in a very positive way because he thrives on it. But as we will see, he takes this control too far. And because he thrives on it, he kind of expects everybody else to thrive on it as well and follow this control that he kind of imposes on everybody else. So he's now in the Navy. And he was first stationed at a place called Bremerton Naval Base, which was in Washington. Now, there he met and he fell in love with 18-year-old Bersaba Rebecca Olabari. I have no idea how you say it. Now, she is just known as Becky, so we're going to call her Becky going forward, obviously. They fell in love. And Ronald was redeployed to New Mexico and Becky followed. And in 1960, they married. Now, the couple went on to have 7 children together. 7 children. Dear God, I've had one. That was painful enough. Anyway, before they married, Ronald's mother, Loretta, actually cautioned Becky against Ronald, warning her about how controlling and temperamental Ronald was. His own mother warned her prospective daughter-in-law about her own son. Becky was in love. Becky didn't listen. Becky was young. Of course she didn't listen. Who listens to their mother-in-law, right? So a year into their marriage, Becky gave birth to their first child. This was Gene Jr. And then a couple of years later, in 1963, she gave birth to their second child, Sheila. Now, around this time, Ronald left the Navy, but his abusive behaviour wasn't going anywhere. If anything, it was probably worsening. He liked to maintain complete control. He would basically dictate how Becky dressed, how she styled her hair, how she would have to have her shirts buttoned up. She couldn't wear makeup. She had to wear her hair a certain way. Basically, he just manipulated everything. He specified what chores she had to do. They had to be carried out to his satisfaction. He began to limit how much time she spent with friends, with family. He basically stripped her of her independence. He denied her access to her mail, everything. This is absolute coercive control. Now, a couple of years after leaving the Navy, Ronald joined the US Air Force. In 1965, Becky gave birth to her third child, Billy, and over the next decade, basically she had 3 more children. She had Loretta in 1970, Eddie in 1973, and Marianne in 1976. During this time, Becky was becoming increasingly submissive to her husband. I think a lot of that was she was trying to protect her children from their father's anger. Now, by the spring of 1976, Ronald was an NCO, which is a non-commissioned officer. This was in the US Air Force. and he had basically risen to the rank of Master Sergeant. He had just completed a 3-year posting in England, actually, over here in this neck of the woods. Now, I couldn't find exactly where, not that it's relevant at all, I was just kind of nosy and curious as to whereabouts in England he was based. I couldn't find any record of that, but it's not really relevant. He was over here for about 3 years, and obviously Becky and the children were here as well. And then he returned to the States, and he was stationed at a Space and Missile Systems Organization Observatory. This was in a place called Alamogordo, which is in New Mexico. As the highest ranking NCO at this facility, he loved the power. He took charge during the absence of the commanding officer, and he absolutely thrived in this role. He was really into the control and the power and the authority that he had. Now, Ronald liked the area around Alamogordo, and he decided this was an area that he wanted to settle down. And he soon found a house to rent, but it was only temporary because the neighbours were a little bit too close by for him. He was a very private man. He likes to keep everybody away from everybody. He likes to keep all his family away from the outside world, I'm guessing because of the things he is doing behind closed doors. So eventually he finds an even more remote place to live in a place called Cloudcroft, which was in Otero County. It was a 3-bedroom house on 3 acres, and it still wasn't to Ronald's liking. It was still a bit too close to anybody, but it was better. It kind of provided enough space to keep the neighbours at a distance, which is what he liked. Now, he was such a stickler for privacy that he built a 10-foot tall wall around his property. I mean, he really didn't want anybody interfering with anything. Now, his poor children, they had to help him build this wall. Basically, these poor kids would have to spend their weekends and their times after school lugging rocks around to build this wall. The poor kids were so exhausted from hauling these rocks around, and they were performing other manual labour as well around the property. I mean, he had these kids working, and they were struggling a little bit in school from what I could tell. These poor kids, they weren't allowed a social life, and this is going to get worse. I mean, this is the beginning of it, but yeah, he kind of keeps the neighbours out, keep everybody private, keeps the kids working. It's just all about him having authority over his family. So in June 1978, Ronald learned that the Air Force was actually deactivating that observatory he was working at, and he was going to be transferred to Holloman Air Force Base in Otero County. I think he wasn't happy about this move, and I think he was still kind of suffering from those feelings of instability growing up and the idea of having to move around all the time. Him losing that position and having to move again, it kind of um, exacerbated his volatile behaviour. And basically, that summer, he lost control and he struck his wife in front of the children. Now, the older children, they were aware that their father physically abused their mother, but this was the first time that it happened in front of them, I believe. Now, Gene Jr., who was 16 at this time, he kind of refused to stand by and watch his father beating his mother, and he tried to protect her, bless him. But obviously, he was 16, he was no match for his father, and Ronald beat his son to the floor, kept beating him. The family were just horrified, obviously, and ultimately, little Gene, he ran away from home. Now, he was taken back by his parents, but it was the beginning for little Gene to kind of see what his father was really like, and he wanted to get away, and he hated his father's control, and he just yearned to leave. He knew that the family would never be safe living under their father. I mean, imagine being 16 years old and knowing this about your own father, you know, this man that is meant to protect you and love you and just do anything for you. And imagine being that scared, not just for yourself, but for your entire family. He was desperate to leave. He just wanted to get out. Now, that August, Ronald actually notified the Air Force of his intention to retire. And so by the time he did retire in 1979, he had accumulated several honours for his military service. He had the Bronze Star Medal, he had the Republic of Vietnam Gallantry Cross, but the most foreboding award that he had was the Air Force Ribbon for exceptional marksmanship. And that is just very, very ominous. And unfortunately, this is a skill that he was going to come to use again out of his retirement, but not for good, with very, very tragic consequences. Now, Ronald is obviously, he's retired now. And by December 1979, his behaviour towards his wife, it's worsening significantly. I mean, he kind of needs the military. It's like he feeds on the control and the power and the authority that he gets from the military. But at the same time, it kind of keeps him a little bit in check as well. And without that, he is just kind of starting to lose it a little bit. You can imagine how much worse it's going to be now because he doesn't have the military to kind of release it on. It's being solely released on his family. So you can imagine, come retirement, things are just going to go to crap. Now, by this time, Becky had actually given birth to their seventh child. So they've now got the 7 children in the house. Her name was Rebecca Lynn. And it wasn't just this power and control, it was also the fact that Ronald had kind of lost any desire for his wife, and unfortunately, he is directing it towards another member of his family. His oldest daughter, Sheila, remember, she was the second born. Now, she was special, she was different. He always treated her differently to all of the other children. She was his absolute favourite. He referred to as his little princess. Now, by July 1980, Sheila was about 16 and he took her on a trip to California for a coin show. Now, Sheila had no interest in coins, she just didn't. But she kind of pretended to share her father's enthusiasm because she could see that her siblings, they would get his anger, his frustration. But Sheila, she knew that she was seeing her father's softer side, and she never understood why. She didn't understand why he liked her the best, but she kind of went along with it because it was better than what her siblings and what her mother was getting. Now, they're on this trip to this coin show in California, and they're driving along, and basically their conversation takes quite an uncomfortable turn. They stop in Phoenix at a hotel because it's quite a long way from where they were to California. So they stop in this hotel in Phoenix. And this is where, according to the authorities, that Ronald had sex with his daughter for the first time. I say have sex, really, I mean, he didn't. He raped her, right? Number one, she's like 16. And number two, she's his daughter. So let's call it what it is. It was rape. He raped his daughter for the first time here. Now, that September, he actually went on to have sex with her a couple more times. And by March 1981, Sheila told him that she was pregnant. She's like 16, 17 years old. She's pregnant. That's scary in itself, being that young, being pregnant. But the father of your child is your own father, is the child's grandfather. Absolutely disgusting. Now, Ronald, he sat down with his wife and his eldest son to basically deliver the news. And he told them that this baby was going to be treated like all the other children in the household and that there would be no further discussion about it. Now, Ronald didn't reveal the identity of the baby's father, but Becky knew damn well. And I'm going to assume that little Jean, he suspected. And the reason that Becky knew damn well, and in fact, from all accounts, from what I can tell, half of the community knew damn well, is because he was seen kissing his daughter on the lips frequently. You know, not on the cheek, not in this kind of father daughter relationship kind of way. This was like full blown passionate kisses. And they would do this in public as well. People in the community saw this. But it didn't matter how disgusted Becky was. She was completely under his control and she complied with his wishes and went along with it. I think this was very much one of those situations where you kind of want to say, as a mother, it's your responsibility to take your child away from that situation. But equally, there needs to be some compassion towards the fact that she couldn't, she had nowhere to go. I mean, don't forget, I say don't forget, I'm not sure if I've mentioned it yet, but certainly what comes to light is that he very much prevents any external influences getting in. In other words, she can't get mail. They've got a phone, but it's not a working phone. She can't just phone somebody for help. She can drive. She's not allowed to drive. Everything is done under his control. So it's not like she could just ask for help. So I don't think it was as easy as just taking her daughter and going. As much as she might have wanted to, it wasn't that easy. And I know that she does try later on to leave. Now, in contrast, in complete contrast, Gene Jr. wasn't as submissive as his mother. He was still resentful towards his father because obviously he'd had this beating. Now, he also knew how unsafe his father would be, and he knew that he couldn't confront his father directly. So little Gene did what his mother should have done, really. He reported his father. Now, Becky urged little Jean not to do that because she was terrified that the children would be taken away if the authorities found out. And she was desperate for him not to, but he did. He didn't listen. And in April 1981, he anonymously reported Sheila's pregnancy to the school counsellor. And like I say, it's what his mother should have done. But obviously, you can understand her fear. You know, she's got these 7 kids and this fear that they're all going to be taken away, not kept together, split up, go to different families, whatever. You kind of think that you're going to deal with it yourself, keep your family together and try and get out some other way. I'm guessing that's the way that she was thinking about it. But little Gene, he's reported his father and good on him. Now, obviously, the school at this point becomes involved. Now, Sheila denies being pregnant at first, a lot of coaxing, and she does break down. And obviously, the authorities become involved. An investigation was launched, and basically there's this threat of prosecution. And so Ronald agrees to a 5-week family counselling program. But he also realised that any incriminating admissions he made during this family counselling, this would all be used against him in court. He realised that he was screwed. Now, in June 1981, Sheila did give birth to a little daughter called Sylvia Gale. And a couple of days later, a sheriff's deputy interviewed Sheila. She refused to cooperate. I mean, I'm guessing she was terrified as well because she's just given birth. She doesn't want her daughter to be taken away. She's scared of her father. She's going to be terrified. But it didn't matter that she refused to cooperate because she was basically put in front of a grand jury. And if she didn't tell the truth, then she would get into trouble. So she had to basically tell the jury everything. And that's what she did. In August 1981, the jurors heard Sheila admit that her father had raped and impregnated her. Now, Ronald, a lovely man, even though Sheila denied at first, she tried to deny. I don't know if she was protecting her father, but she was protecting probably her mother and herself and her baby. And she did deny it all. But through it all, he blamed her. He basically said that she had ruined everything. She had destroyed the family. She had ruined his life for tarnishing the family's reputation. Of course, he didn't do that himself. It was her fault. That's Ronald Gene Simmons, the kind of man that takes zero responsibility for what he has done and blames the other person. Absolute narcissism. So he's like, yeah, it's her fault. She's destroyed their beautiful relationship. He's in cloud cuckoo frickin' land because he basically sees them as having a relationship. Even though this is his daughter, they're in love and it's a relationship. Absolute cuckoo. Later on in court, some letters were revealed, and in one of these letters he wrote to his daughter, he put, "I will see you in hell." He blamed her that much. This poor kid, she's been raped by her father. She's given birth to her father's child, this poor girl, and then he blames her for it all. So anyway, around this time, little Gene, he does move out of the family home, so he's gone. And obviously, the family's reputation has now been tarnished by Sheila, except obviously it wasn't by Sheila, but you know what I mean. So, as far as Ronald's concerned, his family is kind of starting to fall apart. It's starting to unravel. All that authority and control, the years he spent kind of putting in to getting his family to be the way that he wanted them to be, that's all starting to unravel. And he's kind of powerless to stop it because there's this external threat. You know, he's so busy building these walls trying to keep the external threats out. But this one, I mean, we're talking the authorities, they're involved. He can't keep that one out. So what does he do? He takes his family and he runs. He flees to Arkansas. Now, this was an attempt to avoid prosecution. So he goes across state. And what actually happens was he's fled, and 4 days after he flees, the sheriff's office, they arrive at his home in Cloudcroft with an arrest warrant for him, and they find the house empty. So what happens then? Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. Because Ronald's gone. They drop the case. Can you believe that? They drop the case. Now, about 7 months later, in March 1982, the DA, or I don't know, the authorities, whoever they were, in New Mexico, did inform the Department of Human Services in Arkansas that Ronald had been indicted on charges of incest. But the problem was the Arkansas Human Services Department, they kind of lacked any authority to do anything. They couldn't make an arrest. There wasn't really anything they could do. It was a bit of a case of different departments not communicating. The only department that was communicated with in Arkansas was a department that couldn't do anything. But then why they didn't go to the authorities, I'm not sure. All I know is that for the next 6 years, Ronald continued to abuse his daughter. It seems kind of crackers to me that a man leaves a state and the authorities just go, oh, well, he's not here anymore, we'll drop it. He bloody raped his daughter. And what he's about to do next, if something had been done at this point, then this tragedy where 16 people are murdered, it might not have happened. I just don't understand why the police in New Mexico didn't tell the police in Arkansas, because obviously the police would have this power to make the arrest and do something. I don't understand why they just told Human Services, who had no arrest powers. And I don't know. All I know is this guy is actually indicted for incest. Nothing is done. And he goes on to murder 16 people. Absolute disgusting travesty. Disgusting. So the family spent a couple of years moving between various residences because obviously they're kind of on the run a little bit now. You know what Ron's like. He needs to find the perfect place with a suitable amount of space to keep prying eyes out. Now, by the summer of 1983, they moved in to what would become their final home. It's remote. Of course, it's remote. It's 13 acres. And it's known as Mockingbird Hill. And this is in Dover, which is in Pope County in Arkansas. Now, they construct this home out of two mobile homes. They're kind of stitched together to create a big 5-bedroom dwelling. And this place lacks all of the basic amenities. Now, we already know they don't have things like telephone, but there's also no indoor plumbing. So they have to go to the toilet outside in a hole. So the grounds themselves were littered with empty beer bottles, abandoned, rusting vehicles. There was soiled clothing. You get the idea. This kind of big, rambling property with not a lot on it apart from a load of junk and a couple of mobile homes stitched together. There's a massive no trespassing sign. The first thing people see when they come into the drive, there's a long drive up to the property. He does not want a repeat of what happened in New Mexico happening here. So he is going to go out of his way to keep the outside world out. Now, he was bad before. You can imagine after his indictment for incest, he is even worse. And he wanted to make it look like things were normal. So his children still went to school because that would have looked suspicious if they didn't, right? So they still went to school and it looked like everything was fine. The children had a perfect school attendance record and they had their little strict schedules. So they would have to come home and they couldn't visit their friends, they couldn't socialize. And just like that first property, he had them working. They had numerous chores that they had to do around the property, building this wall for one thing around the home. The children would have to dig these holes outside. They would dig drainage ditches. And they also dug a cesspit because, of course, they've got no indoor plumbing. It's very, very sad, but just remember the fact that they're digging these holes. Just remember that. But basically, these poor kids, they didn't have a social life. They literally went to bed at night with bloody hands and bloody feet. Their cries of pain were kind of ignored, even by their mother. She was too scared to defy her husband. I've even seen in some sources, some say that the children would have various hiding places around the property just to get away from their father. I mean, imagine that, being a child so terrified of your own father that you have hiding places to go to just to hide from him. This was the kind of authority that Ronald liked. This is what he exerted over his children. Even the community itself could see that something was weird. People didn't really like him because he was rude and he was standoffish. Now, he did actually need to go out in the community himself because one of the consequences of being on the run is that he lost access to his military pension. He had to work. I mean, he definitely had a series of low wage positions in the nearby town. Now, the nearby town was called Russellville, and as you can imagine, he doesn't do so good in these low wage positions because he has a real problem with authority and he doesn't like these people telling him what to do, and he does not like having to deal with the public. In the military, he had authority, he had the respect of his peers. This is something he lacks in the civilian roles, and it made it difficult for him to kind of adapt to regular working life. There were no actual issues with him performing his work. He was good at his jobs. It was the attitude and the behaviour towards others that was the issue. In particular, his behaviour towards women. That came under mega scrutiny because you can imagine he does not like authority from women. He does not like being told what to do from a woman. So that came under scrutiny. And it's about to get worse because in the spring of 1984, his daughter Sheila, who he loves, he dotes on, she's now 20, she announced that she's getting married to a man called Dennis McNulty. She met him at business school. Ronald was absolutely distraught. He did not take it well. He took it as though she was cheating on him. And he literally swang between kind of depression and rage. But at work, this is where he kind of began developing feelings for another woman, one of his female co-workers. She kind of became a bit of a distraction from the fact that his favourite daughter was going to be deserting him. So he became infatuated with this co-worker. Now, her name was Kathy Kendrick. They worked together in Woodline Motor Freight in 1985. Now, Kathy was actually married and she made it clear that she didn't want anything to do with him. I mean, God, he's vile, right? And sleazy, horrible man. He obviously ignored all that because he is a narcissist and he is entitled to get what he wants, right? And he continues his advances. He showers her with gifts, with flowers. He just makes her feel increasingly uncomfortable. Now, his boss, Joyce Butts, reprimanded him for this kind of inappropriate sexual behaviour that he was showing to Kathy. Ronald does not like that. He does not want to be reprimanded by anybody, let alone a woman. You can imagine the absolute humiliation. Number one, Kathy is like spurning his advances. And number two, this other woman, this boss, is telling him off. He ain't a happy bunny. He resigns and he tells Joyce, "You can take this job and shove it." And he storms out of the building. And he walks up to Kathy while she's on the phone with a customer. And he basically tells her, "I hope you're happy now." In a nutshell, he is blaming everybody else. It's everybody else's fault, right? Absolute narcissist. Everything is everybody else's fault but his. Even after he resigned, he was still stalking Kathy. He would park outside of her house just to catch a glimpse of her. He was obsessed. Now, like I say, he does go on to have other jobs because obviously he's left there now. He's been reduced to seeking this meagre employment. He has little pay, he has little respect, he works with people he doesn't like, who don't respect him, civilian people. He's losing control of his family, of his home. His son's left, his daughter's about to leave. And at work, he doesn't have control. He can't have control. He's there to work and being told what to do. None of it is his fault. None of it. It is. But as far as he's concerned, none of it is his fault. Everybody is wronging him. And he decides that he is going to make everybody that has wronged him pay. Meanwhile, though, for Becky and the children, whilst Ronald is actually at work, it's great for them not having him around. They have a bit more freedom. Equally, Becky is, I mean, she's been seeing it for a while, but she's coming to just understand, especially after what's happened with Sheila, she's coming to understand the monster that he really is. She tries to leave a few times, but she can't. You know, it's not easy for her. Ronald's got an income, he's got a job. She has nothing. She can't call, don't forget. She can't make any contact with the outside world. She can't ask anybody for help. She doesn't have a job. She's got no money. What's she going to do? Where's she going to go? So it's not that easy just leaving. She's got 7 children. Well, I suppose a couple of them have left home. In fact, 3 of them have left home by this point, I think. So she's got 4 kids left at home by this point. So it's definitely becoming easier for her financially as well, because if she's only got 4 children left to support now, it's going to become easier for her to leave. But psychologically, she needs to make that break as well. You know, if you've been controlled by somebody for such an amount of time, you've got to kind of psychologically prepare yourself, psychologically make that move away as well. And it's starting to happen. It is starting to happen. And she also has the help of her children, of little Gene, who has moved away. And he sets up a PO box so that she could basically communicate with him and with other members of the family. They're desperate for her to leave. Her children are helping her, and she is coming to terms with the fact that she has to go. In fact, she wrote a letter to her son, Billy. It's really sad. Basically, she said, "Loretta may be staying in town Friday night, so I'll have her mail this. I've been thinking of all you said, Bill, and I know you are right. I don't want to live the rest of my life with Dad, but I'm still trying to figure out how to start. What if I couldn't find a job for some time? You have to remember, I've never had a job since I've been married, or before that either. I know I have to start somewhere. I've remembered a lot of what you said, Bill. I am a prisoner here, and the kids too. I know when I get out, I might need help. Dad has had me like a prisoner, that the freedom might be hard for me to take. Yet I know it would be great, having my children visit me any time, having a telephone, going shopping if I want, going to church. Every time I think of freedom, I want out as soon as possible. I don't want to put any burden on my children, and I think it's best while or before I get out too old. I want out, but it's the beginning. Once I get a job and place, then I can handle it. With the mental support of my children, I can do it. I hope Loretta can mail this Friday or Saturday on her way home. It's just so sad. You can see here just how much of a prisoner that she felt mentally and physically. It's not a case of just upping sticks and going. It's going to take her time to do this, but she is getting there. Now, also desperate to leave is the fourth child, Loretta. She's 17 at this point, and she's also forming her own exit plan. She was excelling academically. She wanted to get a scholarship. Basically, she was desperate to get away from home. She wanted this scholarship. She wanted to get out of the house as soon as she could. Now, when her father was at work, she was happy. She was a little bit free, her and her mother. When he was at home, they had to literally tiptoe around him. They had to keep quiet. He ignored his wife, he ignored his children, he lay on the couch, he drank beer, he watched television, he just didn't give a crap about his family. Now, on the rare occasions that Loretta did have a friend over, they noticed that she had deadbolts on her door. And when she was asked about this, she looked really sad. And she implied that things weren't as they appeared to be. And it's not really known, it's just speculation that Loretta possibly experienced the same abuse as Sheila did. I don't know, just given the father's history, it's certainly a strong possibility. In fact, according to Becky's sister, Viola, she went around and she said all the children would kind of recoil. They would kind of flinch when their father was around, when he went anywhere near them. So that's just not normal, is it? You don't flinch when your father comes near you. Now, whether that's just the violence, whether that's sexual, I don't know. Definitely the violence. Whether there's anything more, I don't know. But it's certainly suspicious. It's certainly kind of odd behaviour for any of the children. In fact, Ronald, he had his own bedroom and he hardly left it, especially towards the end. I think this got worse. He only left really to go to work. And in this room, he always kept it locked. No one was allowed to go in it. Not even his wife. She slept with the younger children. And unbeknownst to the rest of the family, at the end, when the police kind of went and raided the house, they broke into this room and they discovered kind of shelves and shelves of gourmet food. We're talking things like canned oysters, and there was imported beer and that kind of thing. And he kept all this stuff from his family. His family were living on the basics, and he had this luxury in his room. That's the kind of man he was. Just vile. So by December 1987, he's in this room, he's just drinking all the time, he's got his luxury goods, he's all right, but he's just kind of in there festering, you know, you just imagine this horrible old hillbilly man just kind of festering. He's angry at everybody, and he's aware, he knows his family, at least what's left of it, they're going to be going. Even his wife, who he doesn't even want anymore particularly, but it's that control. He still wants to control her. He still wants to own her. So by December 1987, he is paranoid, he's suspicious, he's festering, he's paranoid about the world and outside interference. Just everything has kind of built up. He's peeved off, he's doing these crappy jobs, he's getting hardly any money, he doesn't get any respect from anybody, you know, nobody at work respects him, nobody in the family, they kind of pretend to respect him, but he knows they're all planning on leaving him and that they don't. And he has had enough, and he has basically decided that he has no intention of letting any more of his family members leave him. And by this point, by December 1987, he was working in a place called Sinclair Mini Mart. And he picked up his final paycheck from there. He'd been there for about a year and a half, and he hated it, just like all the other places. He disliked working with the public, and he found the pay insulting. He was actually scheduled to start his next shift that day, but instead he resigned. And at home, Becky had decided to bring the family together, and he went along with it. He was like, yeah, let's bring the family together. He pretended to help her decorate the house, get the tree. He pretended to be all excited about getting all the family together. His intentions, though, they were completely different to his wife's. His wife wanted her children under one roof. He wanted them under one roof as well. but not because it was Christmas, not because he loved his family, but because he was planning to ensure that none of them would be separated again. He was not going to let them live to see in the new year. And for many family annihilators, they actually kind of pick prominent times of year. And Ronald's no different. He picks Christmas. It's kind of a way of asserting their control and making this powerful statement. And that's what he does. He has these narcissistic traits. He believes that his authority and his control, all of that, that was of paramount importance. And because he's losing control and he's unhappy with everything else, he decides he's going to control them one final time, and he's going to make sure that they don't see in the new year. This is going to be one Christmas to remember, and none of them deserved what he does next. So on the morning of December the 22nd, 1987, Ronald Gene Simmons, he drove to Walmart and he purchased a 22 caliber handgun. This is bizarre to me. Now, I'm British, obviously, and it's very, very bizarre to me that you go to the supermarket and you purchase a gun with your potatoes. It's a very, very strange concept. I don't understand it. That's what he does. He then returned home and he armed himself with his guns. He also had a blunt weapon, like a crowbar or a pipe, something like that. When he returned home on the 22nd, there were 3 members of his family in the house on that Tuesday morning. The precise sequence of events that followed are unknown, but he murdered each one of them. So we've got his 46-year-old wife, Becky. She was bludgeoned. Each blow to her body was his way of ensuring that she wasn't going to leave him. Just to be sure, he shot her twice in the head. She had deep lacerations in her head. She had a bullet wound to her right cheek. She had another bullet wound to the left of her nose. The pillow in the bedroom was soaked with her blood, so presumably he did this to her whilst she was sleeping. He'd obviously gone out in the morning, she was still in bed, and yeah, took her out then. So Ronald's eldest son, little Gene, he's 29 years old now. He was the first to arrive home for Christmas. He was asleep in bed, like his mother had been, when his father approached and struck him on the head and the neck. Gene threw himself out of the bed. He fought. There were bloody handprints and there was blood spatter on the walls, on the furniture, on the closet door. Basically, it showed that there was a struggle between father and son. He tried. And poor little Gene, he knew from the beginning that his family wasn't safe. And he had his mother in the next room. He had his daughter in the next room. He struggled against his father. But Ronald shot him 5 times in the head and the face. He had bullet wounds to the left side of his forehead, to the middle of his forehead, to the left of his nose, to his right eye, the left of his chest. All that kind of frustration that Ronald felt towards his son because his son betrayed him. His son shocked him to the authorities. I don't know if Ronald knew this, but he probably suspected. And even if that wasn't the reason, he was still peeved because he didn't have the authority and that control over his son anymore. His son had left. And each shot was that frustration towards his son. Poor little Gene, he tried desperately to reach his mother and his daughter, but he never even made it through the door. He never made it through the door. Now, whilst this is going on, the neighbours heard shooting coming from the property, but it was hunting season in rural Arkansas. So they just assumed it was people shooting and hunting, and so nobody did anything. Now, like I said, little Jean's 3-year-old daughter, her name was Barbara. She was asleep in the same room as Becky, and she wasn't spared the horrors because when Ronald walked in, he wrapped fishing wire around her neck 5 times. 5 times. around her little neck. She's 3 years old, and strangled her to death. Now, remember I said that the children were made to dig these holes outside. When Ronald murdered his wife, his son, and his granddaughter, he carried their 3 bodies to one of these holes that the children had dug outside. Now, afterwards, he returned to the house and he watched a bit of television, as you do, and he waited for his 4 youngest children to return home from school. So that afternoon, the school bus turns up outside the house and it drops off 17-year-old Loretta and her 3 younger siblings. It was the last school day before Christmas. It's the 22nd of December. What's really sad is that while other children were really, really excited about the fact that it's the holidays, it's Christmas, the children are excited, the Simmons children, not so much. They have to spend time with their father. It's not the happiest time of year for them. However, obviously little Jean had arrived and they were waiting for Sheila and for Billy, their other 2 siblings, to come home. So there would be an element of happiness because the family was going to be reunited. So they were looking forward to that. Now the children walk up the drive, approach the house, and to their surprise, their father's waiting for them. Their father never waits for them. It's always the mother. He's usually sitting on the couch watching TV, drinking. So this is a bit of a shock to them. What's even stranger is that Ronald tells them he has presents for them and he wants to give them the presents individually. They're apprehensive, it's their father, and it's like kind of weird, but they're still excited. So one by one, they let their father lead them into the house to go and get their present. One by one. He starts with Loretta. He starts with the oldest, 17-year-old, takes her to the bedroom, attacks her, strikes her in the face. She had cuts on her lips, consistent with being punched. She struggles against her father, but obviously she is no match. She is no match. Whilst most parents would be proud of their children showing signs of independence and wanting to build this life for themselves, he's mad at her defiance. He pins her to the bed, grabs some fishing wire, wraps it around her neck, and strangles her. Then, to make absolutely certain that she was dead, he dragged her body to a barrel of water. Now, inside the house, because remember there's no inside plumbing, so they have these barrels of water around the house, and he takes her to one of these barrels and he submerged her head underwater just to make sure that she is definitely dead. Ronald repeats this with the remaining 3 siblings. We have 14-year-old Eddie. We have 11-year-old Marianne and 8-year-old Becky. He takes them one by one into the house, strangles each one of them with fishing wire, and then drags their bodies to a barrel of water where he holds their heads under to ensure they are dead. He then takes their bodies to the same pit that little Jean, their mother, and little Jean's daughter is in, and throws these 4 children into the same pit, the pit that they had dug, the pit that would turn out to be their own grave. There are 7 bodies in this pit of one family, mother, children, grandchildren. He then doused the bodies with kerosene and laid barbed wire over the top of them. This was to stop the animals scavenging the remains. It was a trick that he'd learnt during his deployment to Vietnam. But of course, he's not done yet. He's still got 2 kids to go. He goes back into the house and he waits for their arrival. Now, this was on the 22nd. Sheila and Billy aren't due to arrive until the 26th. So for like 4 days, he is sitting in a house waiting to kill 2 remaining children after having killed their siblings and their mother. But he has an award for exceptional marksmanship. He was trained to lie in wait for his target, and this is what he does for 4 days. He sits with dead bodies outside and waits to murder his 2 remaining children. So on the 26th, Ronald's 23-year-old son Billy, his 21-year-old wife Renata, and their 20-month-old son Trey They were the first to arrive on this day. Now, Billy, he was hopeful that his mother was making progress towards leaving their father. That letter that I read to you was one of the letters from her to him. So, he's got this hope that she is getting prepared. She's definitely more mentally prepared than she was. She knows she's going to be leaving him. So Billy goes around just praying that his father doesn't suspect anything. They walk in the house, they're sitting at kind of the kitchen table, and Ronald attacks. According to the medical examiner's report, the muzzle of Ronald's gun was about a foot away from Billy's head. He was shot twice, once in the right cheek and again in the skull, just above his ear. Renata, his wife, was shot 7 times, 5 times in the head and twice in the neck. And then Trey. Trey is 20 months old. Ronald swoops him up, strangles him, and drowns him in that barrel of water. Now, he was the only one of the children actually on the coroner's report that said he died by drowning. All the other children were strangled, even though they were dunked in the water. So I'm assuming in Trey's case, the strangulation didn't work and he was ultimately drowned. Ronald's grandchild is drowned in a barrel of water. The last to arrive is his favourite daughter, his little princess. Now, just before she arrives, obviously there's these bodies in the house. So Ronald basically covers Billy and Renata with a coat. So when Sheila walks in, it's not known whether she saw the bodies lying on the ground, but it's possible. For Trey, he puts him or wraps him in a plastic trash bag. And he takes his tiny body to one of the abandoned cars on the property. He throws them in a trunk. I don't know why he does that. To me, it's almost like making this point of removing the child away from the parents. When you die, you want to be with your loved ones. And it's almost like he's making this point of putting Trey away from them. I mean, I don't know. That's just kind of what I'm reading into it. I find it very strange. Why put him in the trunk of a car? Why wrap him in a trash bag? What is the significance of that? What is he trying to say? It's bloody horrendous. Now, Sheila, she's 24 now. She's anxious. She's about to see her abuser, but she wants to see her family. She has her 33-year-old husband, Dennis, by her side, so that's going to make it a lot easier for her. She's also got with her 7-year-old Sylvia, Ronald's daughter, as well. They also have a 21-month-old son called Michael together, and they were the perfect little family. And Sheila kind of got her happy ever after that she deserved away from her abusive father. She found this man who loved her, who treated her daughter as if she was his own, and they had this son together. They were just happy. Sheila walks in the house. Ronald shot her 6 times in the head. The second she walked in, like I say, it's not known if she saw the other bodies. I hope she didn't. I really hope she didn't. But she basically was found lying by the Christmas tree. And she was covered in a tablecloth. All the other bodies were covered in coats. Sheila was still in death, the precious one. From outside, Dennis obviously heard the gunshots. He races through the door, and Ronald shot him straight in the head at close range. The bullet entered his brain. He died instantly. He didn't stand a chance. Baby Michael, strangled, dumped in the water. Now, his body also was wrapped in a trash bag and stuffed into the trunk of a different car. It kind of makes a bit more sense with Sheila because he's going to see this child as an imposter because it's with another man. As horrendous as it is, that impersonality, it kind of makes sense that he would do that with this son. Sylvia, his daughter / granddaughter. She's 7 years old. She sees what's happened to her brother and to her mother and to the man she considers her father. Absolutely terrified. She runs into one of the bedrooms. Ronald follows her and he uses his knees to pin down her arms. He wraps the wire around her neck and strangles her. Her lifeless body was found face down on the bed. He had wiped out 14 members of his family. He then drives to Russellville. He stops at a Sears store, picks up the gifts that had been ordered before Christmas. People don't know for certain why he did this. I think he was possibly thinking he could get away with this and that if he left the gifts there, it would look suspicious. So he picked them up to make it look like they'd been picked up. That's what I think. But nobody really knows for sure why he did that. It's a kind of weird thing to do. After he picks up these gifts, he then goes to a bar and he orders drinks and he makes a toast to Sheila. Because in his view, her betrayal had been the most devastating of all the betrayals. And he drinks a drink to Sheila. He then returns home and once again he watches TV, he drinks some more beer, he goes to sleep. It's the 26th of December. It's a Saturday. He has dead bodies. There are 7 bodies in a pit outside. And then he has bodies in the house. And he carries on watching TV and drinking and sleeping. And he does this until Monday because he's not finished. On Monday morning, his killing spree is going to resume. He is not done yet. So, December the 28th, 1987. Ronald drives his son's car to Walmart and he restocks his guns and his ammunition. Now, don't forget, nobody has any idea what he has done to his family at this point. What he does next is going to be the first time that the authorities get any inclination of what he has done. So, his first target was the law offices of Peel, Eddy and Gibbons. And there is where 24-year-old Kathy Kendrick worked as a secretary. Now, remember Kathy Kendrick? Kathy was the woman that he was infatuated with. He worked with at this motor freight place. She was now working in these law offices. And he walked into these offices. He shot her 4 times in the head as revenge for rejecting him, for humiliating him. Next, Ronald went to Taylor Oil Company. Now here he shot, but only injured. He didn't kill, fortunately, but he did shoot 38-year-old Rusty Taylor. Now he was the owner of both Taylor Oil, but also Sinclair Mini Mart, which is the place where Ronald was working for about a year and a half. That was the last job he had. And this guy, Rusty, he owned that place. So Ronald shot him. I'm not quite sure why he wanted to shoot Rusty, but he did. He was the primary target. Unfortunately, this other man, 34-year-old Jim Chaffin, he was a part-time firefighter and he also worked part-time as a truck driver for Taylor Oil. He'd actually just finished a shift fighting fires and he walked through the door of Taylor Oil, and I'm not sure that they even knew each other. He was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and Ronald shot him. Now, Ronald also fired a shot at another employee, a woman called Julie Money. Now, the bullet basically scraped across the top of her head and she fell to the ground thinking that she had been shot. And so did Ronald. Ronald thought that she'd been shot as well. Fortunately, he'd missed. Ronald then makes his way to Sinclair Mini Mart, and there he shot and wounded the manager, David Salyer, and also an employee, Roberta Woolery. Whilst all this is going on, the emergency services are getting these frantic calls because there is this man going around shooting people in various places. The community is in a panic because nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows who is being targeted. Nobody at this point knows that it's Ronald. And it's only actually when he gets to the mini mart that Roberta Woolery, the employee, she actually recognises him and she speaks to the dispatcher, and that is the moment that he is ID'd. And still, nobody has a clue what he has done back at the house. This is a 45-minute rampage across Russellville. Now, it's not over yet. He's got one more stop to do. And this final workplace visit is to Woodline Motor Freight, which is the place that he worked with Joyce Butts. Now, remember, Joyce Butts was the supervisor who reprimanded him for kind of his sexual advances to Kathy. He walks in, shoots her in the head and chest. Miraculously, Joyce survived. I don't think he realised at the time, but she does go on to survive. He then takes another employee into an office and he holds her at gunpoint. Her name is Vicky Jackson. And it becomes like a hostage situation. But he actually instructed her to call the police. And he actually tells Vicky that he's done what he wanted to do. He says that he's gotten everybody who wanted to hurt him. This is what everything is about. He's just getting revenge on the people he thinks has wronged him. Nobody's bloody wronged this man. He is a complete narcissist who nobody has wronged. So he sits kind of sitting and chatting with Vicky in this office and waits for the police to come. And from what I can tell, I mean, I think there was some resistance, but there wasn't a whole lot of resistance. And the police got him and he was taken to a local detention centre. From what I can gather, I think his original intention was to take his own life. Now, that's very, very common amongst family annihilators. They do tend to take their own lives. Now, in this particular case, he realized that he was having to shoot people multiple times. Like these guns, I know nothing about guns, but from what I can gather, he was scared that one shot to himself was not going to be enough to kill him, and that basically he didn't want to be left in this kind of vegetative state. What an absolute dickhead. Basically, he told his brother-in-law, do you know what kind of ammunition I was using? 22 caliber hollow points. They don't penetrate, they splatter. I did not want to shoot myself and become a vegetable. So basically it was okay for his victims, but not for him. What an absolute vile piece of shite. So they've got Ronald now, and this is the first time they get an inkling that there's something else going on, because they're aware that he has this big family, and so they obviously become concerned for the family. So later that day, officers go to Ronald's property and they discover the bodies of Billy, Renata, Sheila, Dennis, and Sylvia. They were inside the house. So they have the 5 family members, but obviously they know that he's got this big family. So this hunt for the remaining family members ensues. And it wasn't until the following morning that one of the investigators, they spot there's kind of metal on the ground and the ground obviously looks disturbed or whatever. That's when they approach it and smell the kerosene and they start digging, and 7 family members inside this pit covered with this barbed wire. But they realise then there's still the 2 little babies, you know, and so another hunt ensues. Eventually they open the trunks of the cars and they find the bodies of Trey Simmons and Michael McNulty. Basically, Ronald Gene Simmons took the lives of 14 members of his own family, and he killed 2 co-workers and he wounded several other people. In total, 16 people lost their lives, all because of his need for control, his desire for revenge when he believed he was losing that authority that he narcissistically believed he was entitled to. So on December the 30th, Ronald was transferred to a psychiatric unit in Arkansas State Hospital. And basically, after about a month-long psychiatric evaluation, he was determined to be mentally competent to stand trial. He understood every single thing he had done. He even told his attorneys that he was guilty and he wished to be convicted and executed. Basically, he wanted to die. Like I say, family annihilators often will take their own lives, but because he was scared to do it himself and become this vegetable, he wanted the state to do it for him. He was a coward. He didn't want to carry on living, but he didn't want to do it himself. Now, it's a bit complicated. Ultimately, he ended up facing 2 trials. Now, the first trial was in May 1988, and that was in Franklin County Circuit Court. Now, this was about 45 miles away from Russellville, and that was because he wouldn't have been able to get like an unbiased jury in Pope County. Now, during this first trial, this was just for the murders of Kathy Kendrick and James Chaffin. and also for the attempted murders of Julie Money, Rusty Taylor, David Salyer, Roberta Woolery, and also Joyce Butts. And it was also for the kind of kidnapping hostage situation of Vicky Jackson. So this first trial was nothing to do with any of his family members. He was convicted, obviously, and on May the 16th, Judge Patterson sentenced Ronald to death by lethal injection plus 147 years. I'm guessing the plus 147 years is just in case the death sentence doesn't get carried out, just to make sure that he does stay behind bars for the rest of his life. But Ronald was happy with that verdict. He was more than happy. He was ecstatic with the verdict. And he actually read a prepared statement. What he said was, "My statement is that if the jury renders the most proper and just and wise sentence of death in this case, I, Ronald Gene Simmons, Sr., want it to be known that it is my wish and my desire that absolutely no action by anybody be taken to appeal or in any way change this sentence. It is further respectfully requested that this sentence be carried out expeditiously." Okay, so basically, a very long-winded way of saying, kill me now, and I don't want to appeal this. He concluded his statement by saying, "I only ask for what I deserve. Let the torture and the suffering in me end. Please allow me the right to be at peace." The torture and suffering in me to end. What about the torturing and suffering you did to those poor babies when you wrapped wire around their throats and drowned them? What about their torture and suffering? Allow you the right to be at peace? How frickin' dare you say you've got a right to be at peace? Go burn in hell. What an absolute arsehole. Really, that really peeved me off when I read that. Anyway, basically he's saying he doesn't want to appeal. Now things get a bit complicated here because his execution date is scheduled for June the 24th, 1988, which is about 6 weeks after his conviction. Now, that's a really, really short amount of time. So basically, what it meant was that there wouldn't be enough time to do another trial for his family. Now, for some people, that was a good thing because they just wanted him to die straight away. For other people, they believed that he should face justice and face trial. I mean, if I was a family member, I would probably want him to face trial for the things that he did to the family. But I can also see why some people were like, no, just kill him now. But the problem was there was lobbyists like a church group. They basically said that the death sentence should be appealed. So there was a stay of execution, basically. So his execution never went ahead. This was overruled and he was given another date. But then once again, there was another stay of execution. And this went on a couple of times because other death row inmates, they were really, really annoyed with Ronald because they felt that he was kind of setting a precedent, that by him not appealing, that they also were going to be executed quickly. They were really peeved with him for not appealing his death sentence. In fact, Ronald had to be monitored whilst on death row because there were a number of attempts made against his life. So, long story short, this original execution date, it didn't go ahead. There was a stay of execution because various people kind of stepped in and said, no, he can't be executed. He's got to appeal. So he's given a new day, and then there was another stay, and then he was given another day and another stay, whatever. Long story short, all these delays meant that he would have to stand trial, the second trial, because with all these stays and him getting all these multiple execution dates, it ended up being that there was enough time to do this second trial for the murder of his family. So this second trial commenced on February the 9th, 1989. And this was in Johnson County, which was approximately 25 miles northwest of Russellville. The atmosphere was very, very tense, and it necessitated the need for extra security. I think there were armed people in the courthouse. There were armed people on the roofs. It was all pretty tense, people were pissed at him. You can imagine those poor jurors and the poor people inside this courtroom having to view the evidence, the crime scenes, the photos, the video evidence, all that stuff. People were just so appalled. In fact, there was this strong emotional response, emotional reactions from some of the jury members. They were weeping. Family members, they asked, The reporters who were sitting in the front row, they asked them to shield them from this kind of gruesome content from these photographs and from this imagery. The family members just didn't want to see it. All the while, Ronald completely detached. There's all this disturbing footage going on, and he's just, yeah, whatever. Absolutely vile. I think what it was, though, was for Ronald, he was just fed up because he just wanted to die. He just wanted the execution. And he was determined to make it happen. At one point, he actually punched the prosecutor in the courtroom. He was basically doing everything in his power to secure a death penalty ruling. He did not want his defense attorneys kind of humanizing him, basically persuading the jurors to give him a prison sentence over a death sentence. He wanted this act of violence towards the prosecutor to be the last thing that the jury kind of saw before they were deliberating, and it did work. The jury took 4 hours to deliberate, and they returned with a guilty verdict on all 14 counts of murder. And on February the 11th, 1989, the judge sentenced Ronald to death again, and this execution date was scheduled for March of that year. Now, once again, we have these stays coming in, things were postponed, everything was overturned again, blah, blah, blah. Ultimately, May 31st, 1990, the then Governor Bill Clinton, Bill Clinton? Who the fuck's Bill Clinton? The then Governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton, he signed Ronald's final execution warrant. And this new date was set for June the 25th, 1990. Now, this was nearly 2 years after the originally scheduled execution. I mean, we've gone from the originally scheduled execution date being 6 weeks after the first trial to now 2 years later. But this was it. There were no more stays. Nothing else happened. Nobody else intervened. Ronald Gene Simmons was going to die this time. So on the day of his execution, he was served the same final meal he had requested for his previous executions. Basically, the final meal that he requested was a filet mignon, I don't know, steak, onions, sliced tomatoes, bread rolls, 7-Up. Sounds delicious. Not. Anyway, that was his final meal. So the first solution was administered at 9:02 p.m. and he was pronounced dead 17 minutes later. His final words were, "Justice delayed, finally be done, is justifiable homicide." He's basically saying that everything was delayed a million times, but in the end, justice was done. Well, he really is a narcissist, right? Because only he would think he got the justice that he deserved. It's all about him. It's all about Ronald Gene Simmons. Absolute cuckoo. Anyway, guess what? No family members claimed his body. Well, that's probably because he killed them all. So on June the 27th, 1990, he was buried in basically a pauper's grave at Lincoln Memorial Lawn in Varna, Lincoln County. I'm guessing he got this pauper's grave because nobody claimed him. Number one, there was nobody left to claim him, probably, and anybody that was left, I mean, God, would you want him? No. I mean, I think personally, even going in a grave was too good. I mean, if you look at this grave as well, it talks about his army career. I mean, I know you can't really put serial killer on there. I don't know. Just put nasty piece of work or something on there. I don't know. This just looks too kind of honourable. Anyway, ultimately, the fact that he was able to pull the trigger on other people but not himself, it shows that he was nothing more than a coward. I don't care what his gravestone says. He was a coward and he was a bully. And I'm glad he's rotting alone in a pauper's grave. That is a fitting end, you know? It's just an absolute shame that he wasn't forced to dig that hole himself first. So that's it. That is everything I have about Ronald Gene Simmons. What an absolute shit, right? What an absolute shit. To do that I mean, to do that at any time of year is horrendous, but to do that at Christmas, and those poor kids, they had suffered enough. They already dreaded the Christmas holidays, and to do that, my heart bleeds for those poor kiddies. By the time this video is edited, I mean, for me, it's Christmas Eve now, so it's going to be Christmas Day tomorrow. By the time this video is edited, Christmas will have been and gone. I hope you all had a wonderful time. Spend time with your family, spend time with the people you love. You look after yourselves. Let me know what you think, and see you back here for another case at my true criminal abode. And my stomach is rumbling, and I need to go and cough my guts up now. I literally need to go and just cough my guts up. I've left you with a really lovely thought, haven't I? Okay, bye.